Hello, you're watching Eye on Africa. I'm James Creedon. These are our headlines this evening. Now, it's a significant step forward for relations between France and Rwanda. Emmanuel Macron recognises a damning responsibility on the part of the French state in the Rwandan genocide back in 1994. We'll bring you all the details on that. In Mali, the interim president and the prime minister have been released 3 days after they were detained and stripped of their powers in what appears to be the country's second coup d'etat in 9 months. More on that coming up. And in DR Congo, the city of Goma is being evacuated over fears of volcanic activity at nearby Mount Nyiragongo. We'll hear from The Economist's magazine's correspondent in the region. Thank you for watching. Now we start in Rwanda, where Emmanuel Macron has admitted French responsibility in the 1994 genocide there. The French president made a landmark speech at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. It was intended to draw a line in the sand after 20 years of diplomatic tensions. The visit follows the release of a report by a French inquiry back in March. It concluded that a colonial attitude had blinded French officials who were too close to the Hutu-led government that perpetrated the genocide on mostly Tutsi victims. The report said the French government bore a serious and overwhelming responsibility in not having foreseen the massacres that were to come. Let's take a listen to some of what Emmanuel Macron said today in Kigali.
France did not understand that while trying to safeguard against a regional conflict or a civil war, it was still standing by a genocidal regime. By ignoring the warnings of the most lucid observers, France then bore a damning responsibility in a spiral that led to the worst, even though it was precisely what it was trying to avoid.
Now, Ornella Rovetta joins us now from Brussels. Ornella, you're a history researcher at the Free University of Brussels with expertise on the Rwandan genocide, in particular regarding criminal responsibility for those who participated in genocide. Thank you for talking to us this evening on France 24. Now, you're also the author of a book entitled A Genocide in the Docks. As I said, the legal aspect of things. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first of all, Nicolas Sarkozy, former French president, he travelled to Kigali back in 2010. Now, at that time, he recognised, quote, serious errors on the part of France, as well as a form of blindness. Now, today, Emmanuel Macron, 11 years on, he spoke of damning responsibility. He asked for forgiveness, but he didn't apologise, crucially, as many Rwandan associations and indeed Kigali were asking. Does this really put anything fundamentally new on the record?
Yes, good evening. So indeed, Sarkozy traveled after actually the diplomatic relations between both countries had been broken for a couple of years. Now, Emmanuel Macron traveled after the release of this report you mentioned. What is important here is the recognition of the political responsibility. No apologies, but a sort of indirect apology. We might see that. And what I think is important here, too, is the message not only about the fact that France was blind. It's actually more than that, and that is true historically, is the fact that there was a silence. There was a silence before, during and after the genocide, not only France, of course, also the international community. But so this political responsibility is let's say, the strong message that he perhaps wanted to convey. And this is a kind of steady feature we see in other such speeches, such as the United States in 1998 or Belgium in 2000.
Okay, and so that's for political, I suppose, politicians accepting responsibility. But there's also a lot going on in the courts, isn't there, here in Europe, in France, in Belgium. Now, your expertise, as I said, is on the judicial responsibility side of things. When it comes to the Rwandan genocide, France's legal system, as well as Belgium's, has universal jurisdiction when it comes to genocide. There have been 3 trials so far of so-called génocidaires, or participants in the genocide. Kigali says that there are many more who participated in the genocide back in 1994 who were resident here in France. What can we expect to happen going forward? Emmanuel Macron wants a line in the sand politically, but what about judicially? What can we expect to happen now?
So he also called in his speech for justice, for more steps to be taken for justice. Now, many more are still to be tried, but I think it's important to underline that many so-called genocidaires, as you mentioned, have been tried. And to understand this, we have to look at the bigger picture. It's not only about France or Belgium with this universal jurisdiction, it's also about an international court, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was created by the United Nations and prosecuted and sentenced over 70 persons, 3 trials in France, 5 in Belgium. But so there is already a lot that has been done. And of course, we have to look at what was done in Rwanda. But so, yes, we are speaking about genocide. We are speaking about crimes against humanity. And so this means that as long as the suspects are alive, they might be prosecuted before a court in Belgium, in France, in Europe, in Rwanda, or before the International Court.
So do you think what Emmanuel Macron said today will be enough to meaningfully move relations forward between Rwanda and France? Is this going to be the line in the sand, so to speak, that Paris is hoping for, a sort of reset in relations?
It's certainly an important step, but it's certainly not the end of the path. So there are many other steps to be taken. New diplomatic relations will start. An ambassador is going to be sent to Kigali. But there is also the question of how France is going to look at its past. The Duclerc report is an important step, but there are many other things ongoing. There's the question of memory, the question of recognition of the victims, the question of justice we just have discussed, and there's also the question of how France is dealing with its own past, what kind of history is going to be written in the next years, and of course it has been written now for over 27 years already.
Ornella Rovetta, thank you so much for those thoughts and insights from Brussels. Now, it's the season for reparations. Namibia says Germany has agreed to fund projects worth more than €1 billion over the next 30 years. This in order to atone for its role in genocide and property seizures in its then colony. Thousands of Herero and Nama people were killed by German colonial forces between 1904 and 1908. Those tribes had rebelled against German rule of the colony, then named German Southwest Africa. Now, 9 rounds of negotiations eventually saw Berlin agree to a joint declaration outlining that agreement. Now, it's been a week of major political upheaval in Mali. The country's interim president and the prime minister have been released 3 days after they were detained and stripped of their powers in what appears to be the country's second coup d'etat in 9 months. France, the US and the United Nations had demanded the release of the two, but calls for a return to civilian rule in Bamako have not been heeded. Emerald Maxwell and Yana Lee have more.
3 days after being taken into custody by the military junta, the Malian transitional president and prime minister have been released from this military base outside Bamako. But not before both men resigned from their positions in front of international mediators.
Il y avait des différends profonds, tant sur la forme que sur le fond, pour ce qui concerne le fonctionnement de la transition. Donc c'est pour cela que finalement, M. Bandao, président de la transition, a présenté sa lettre de démission. Donc cela s'est passé en présence de M. Goodluck Jonathan.
The man behind Monday's arrests is Colonel Assimi Goïta, the transitional vice president who also orchestrated Mali's coup last year. He recited a list of accusations against the president and the prime minister. The latter had allegedly violated the transitional charter by forming a new government without consulting him, a cabinet that didn't include 2 major former junta leaders. Mediators from the West African bloc, ECOWAS, alongside a UN peacekeeping mission, are continuing negotiations with the military amid what the international community is calling a second coup in 9 months.
Time now for news in brief from across the continent. Somalia's government has announced that delayed elections will now be held within 60 days. This follows months of deadlock. The central government in Mogadishu, as well as leaders of Somalia's 5 states, had up to now failed to come to an agreement on the terms of a vote. Violence had erupted ahead of the scheduled election last February, leading to the cancellation of voting. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa will no longer appear for a second round of testimony before a graft inquiry Next week, Ramaphosa was due to appear before a judicial commission looking into corruption. He previously appeared in mid-April as current leader of the African National Congress Party. It's unclear when a second hearing will now take place. He was due to be asked about his role as deputy president in Jacob Zuma's administration. Nigerian rescue workers have retrieved 36 bodies from the water after an overcrowded riverboat sank. 150 people remain missing and are likely to have drowned. Officials said only 20 people were rescued on Wednesday when the wooden boat broke apart and sank between central Niger State and Wara in northwest Kebbi State. To DR Congo next, where orders were issued on Thursday to evacuate Goma, that's a city lying in the shadow of Mount Nyiragongo volcano. Now, the proximity with Lake Kivu means a particularly rare risk of what is known as limnic eruption. That is volcanic activity causing a spew of lethal gas from a lake. Now, The Economist's Great Lakes correspondent Olivia Ackland is just over the border in Rwanda. She had been in Goma before fleeing, like thousands of others. Earlier, she spoke to France 24. Let's take a listen.
On Saturday night, the sky glowed orange. And the scene this morning in Goma was quite reminiscent to Saturday night, just people fleeing in different directions. Thousands of people have headed towards Sake, a city to the west of Goma. And I saw some aerial footage this morning of just the road just clogged with motorbikes and people and cars and trucks. And everyone just trying to get out as far as they can. We've experienced more than 250 earthquakes since the eruption on Saturday. So when I was in Goma, every half hour, the house would shake. One earthquake was big enough to send a building in the center of town tumbling down. And we just don't know what's going to happen next. People are very frightened. If a huge amount of carbon dioxide does come out of the lake, it could be fatal for hundreds of thousands of people living on the shores of Lake Kivu. The governor, in his broadcast, he asked for people from 8 different districts in the center of town to leave at once. I don't know exactly because there hasn't been a census in Goma for a long time, so we don't know the exact numbers, but it's around 600,000 people. But more than that have fled. I think people are frightened, and people not only from those districts have fled because of this threat particularly of the gas coming out of the lake, which is actually a more frightening threat than lava erupting. There's a possibility that lava could erupt from a fissure in town. There's already a big gap in the ground close to the central hospital, and lava could explode from there, which would be very dangerous. But I think even worse would be this possibility of a limnic eruption in which the whole town could be asphyxiated.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this edition of Eye on Africa. Do stay tuned, more news to follow.
In Hong Kong, young activists have lost all hope of independent justice. With the courts under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party, the leaders of the democratic movement are going into exile rather than face trial.
We have responsibility and duty to help those who contact us for help.
We will continue to fight for Hong Kong. We will not give up.
The future of democracy and Hong Kong's young generation is under siege. Don't miss Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.